My name's David Turner. Back in the fall of 2017, I was 33 years old and going through one of the rougher times of my life. I'd worked in roofing for years out in Missouri, but work had slowed down, and a breakup earlier that year left me with more quiet time than I knew what to do with. I didn't have kids, didn't really have anyone close anymore. I had some money saved, and I'd always told myself I wanted to build something of my own from scratch, just with my own two hands. So I bought a patch of cheap forested land about 20 minutes from a little town called Fredericktown, far enough out that no one would bother me, but not so far that I'd die if I cut myself bad with a saw. It was 30 acres of mostly pine and oak. I parked my truck up a gravel road, then carried everything else by hand. I planned to build a one-room off-grid cabin, simple, dry, and solid. That was the whole goal. The first few weeks were fine. I cleared a patch in a small valley tucked between two ridges, near a trickle of a creek that sounded nice when the wind was low. The air smelled clean out there. The soil was rough and full of roots, but it was nothing I couldn't work around. I built a small foundation using cinder blocks and packed dirt, and I framed up the floor platform using pressure-treated lumber I hauled in over several trips. By the end of October, the temperature dropped quick at night, and I was still working with nothing more than a tarp strung up over some poles to keep the rain off. My hands got stiff, but I didn't mind. Felt good to sweat again. Felt good to do something real. I slept in my truck, or, when I felt braver, just rolled out a sleeping bag near the worksite under the tarp. It was early November when things started feeling strange. There wasn't any single moment where everything flipped, like in the movies. No one jumped out from behind a tree or left me a warning sign. It was more subtle than that. And because I was alone, everything that felt even a little bit wrong stuck around in my head longer than it should have. I noticed it the night after the first serious rainstorm. It had rained hard, steady for hours. I sat under my tarp near a small fire I kept going just long enough to dry my socks. I couldn't sleep with wet feet. I had a little LED lantern and a notepad I used to keep track of lumber measurements. I flipped through it, listening to the sound of water dripping off branches around me, when I got that feeling, like someone was watching me. It was cold. The fire popped every now and then. I looked up into the woods, trying to tell myself it was nothing, just a squirrel or an owl or the trees settling under the water weight. But the feeling didn't leave. It stuck in my chest and made me breathe slow, careful, like I didn't want to make a sound. I told myself I'd been alone too long, that my brain was just chewing itself up from all the silence. But it didn't stop the way I kept looking over my shoulder that night. The next morning, I found boot prints in the soft mud near where I kept my stacked lumber. I hadn't walked that way since the day before the rain, and these prints were deep, spaced like a man walking slow. Not mine. I wore size 11 boots with a wide tread. These were narrower and smaller, maybe size 9 or 10, with a smooth sole that didn't match my boots at all. I stared at them for a long time, then circled the area, trying to see where they came from or went. But they just stopped. Not like the person walked back. Just stopped like they stood still and vanished. I didn't have cell service out there. I kept a CB radio in the truck, but only used it to check the weather. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't know who I'd tell. Anyway, it wasn't enough to go to the sheriff about, and I didn't want to leave. I told myself it might have been a hunter or a hiker. I kept working. I framed the walls that week. I built a small window space in the back wall, just a rectangle to bring in some light during the day. I kept all my tools close at night, even when it was dry. I set up tripwire lines made from fishing string and bottle caps tied on the ends so they'd clink if anyone passed. I didn't tell anyone about that either. It made me feel half crazy, but I did it anyway. Another week passed. Then another storm rolled in. It was worse than the first. Heavy winds, sideways rain, thick enough that my tarp started to sag in the middle. I stayed awake that night in the truck, watching the trees thrash under my headlights. At about 2 in the morning, I heard what I thought was someone trying to open the tailgate. I froze. I didn't sit up, didn't move my hands. I just listened. The wind howled, and something metal shifted behind me. I thought maybe it was the extra gas can I left tied to the bumper. Then came 3 knocks, slow, hard, right on the side panel of the truck bed. Not random, not a branch. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I held my breath so long my chest burned. I didn't move until the sun started to rise and the rain finally slowed. When I stepped out, everything looked normal. The truck was fine. My tools were fine. My lumber was untouched. But I couldn't find the fishing line I'd strung along the tree line. It was gone like someone had taken it down carefully. That day, I drove into town, bought another padlock, a trail cam, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I still didn't talk to anyone, not even the gas station clerk who asked how the cabin was going. I just said fine and kept moving. Back at the site, I mounted the trail cam on a tree facing the clearing. I pointed it right at the lumber pile and the new tarp I strung up tighter than before. I didn't expect it to catch anything. It was more to calm my nerves than anything else. The wind didn't let up for days. Even when it didn't rain, the sky stayed low and gray like it was waiting. I kept building, put up the roof trusses, nailed down the first layer of plywood sheathing, bent over every few minutes to pick soaked leaves out of the way. The trail cam light blinked green whenever I walked past it, and I checked it every night, but for 3 days, nothing. On the 4th night, it rained again. Not as hard as before, but enough that I didn't sleep outside. I curled up in the truck with my sleeping bag zipped to the chin and the new flashlight on my chest. Around 1 a.m., I heard something outside again, this time softer, like someone moving slowly over wet leaves, trying not to make noise. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. It came from the back of the truck again, but not knocking this time. More like someone dragging their hand across the side panel. A slow scrape that went from the tailgate to the driver's door. Then nothing. The next morning, I got out fast, ran around the truck, checked everything.
No scratches, no dents.
But the mud was packed down in 2 spots behind the cab, like someone stood there for a long time. No tracks, just packed earth, like they had waited and stared. I pulled the trail cam card and popped it into my old laptop. One clip at 2:13 a.m. I opened it. The video was grainy in the rain, but I could see the tree line. For 20 seconds, nothing moved. Then, just at the edge of frame, a shape, barely a silhouette, stepped into view. Person.
No flashligra, no hatch, no gear.
Just a dark figure. They didn't come forward. They just stood there at the edge of the trees for about 10 seconds, then backed out again without turning. My skin crawled. It wasn't a hunter. No hunter would sneak around someone's land at night without a flashlight or reflective gear. I saved the clip to a thumb drive just in case. But I didn't call anyone. I just stared at that tree line until dark. By then, the cabin walls were up, roof nearly done. I nailed in the last boards with shaking hands. I made sure I could lock the door from the inside. I put up a second layer of tarp on the roof until I could shingle it. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat inside the half-built cabin with my flashlight on and a hammer in my lap. The rain came again the next evening. This time colder, like sleet trying to find a way through your jacket. The wind made the trees groan like they were leaning in to watch. I tried to sleep again in the truck, but I couldn't. Just before dawn, I saw something move outside the window of the cabin. Just a flicker of shape. I waited. After 5 minutes of silence, I ran for the trail cam again. The footage was worse this time, grainier, but the same figure showed up. Only this time, it didn't stop at the edge of the trees. Came all the way forward, crouched near the lumber pile, and stayed there for at least 30 seconds. Then it stood and left. Never looked at the camera. Never looked anywhere but at the cabin. I left the next morning, packed everything, nailed plywood across the door and windows of the cabin. I didn't want to abandon it, but I couldn't stay out there any longer. Something was wrong. Whoever that person was, they didn't want to talk. They didn't want to be seen, and they kept coming back. I showed the video to a guy I knew in town, someone who'd lived there all his life. He just frowned and said I wasn't the first one to try building back there. Said someone else tried it years ago, but the project stopped halfway just like mine. I asked him why. He didn't say. I haven't been back to the cabin since. It's probably rotting now, tarp ripped to shreds, maybe stripped for lumber by now. I still have that video clip on my hard drive, though. Sometimes I watch it just to remind myself it was real, that I wasn't imagining things. But I know this. I wasn't alone in those woods, and whatever or whoever kept coming to my build site never said a word, never left a mark. But they didn't want me there, and I listened. It was late October, 2013, when I decided to take a break from everything and head out to a remote cabin my uncle once used for deer hunting. I was 34 then and living just outside Boise, Idaho, working as a technician for a security company. I'd gone through a rough year. My girlfriend had moved out a few months earlier. My truck needed a new transmission I couldn't afford, and my job was draining the life out of me. I just wanted a week away from everything. Somewhere quiet, isolated, without phone signal or people. The cabin was deep in the forest near the Salmon Chalice National Forest. It was something my Uncle Jim had built back in the early 90s. He used to hunt there every year until he had a stroke in 2010 and sold off all his gear. The place hadn't been used much since then. I remembered it vaguely from when I was a teenager. A small one-room structure, no plumbing, just a rain barrel, a wood stove, and a metal cot. I figured it was exactly what I needed. A week alone with my rifle, some canned food, a lot of firewood, and silence. I parked my Jeep about half a mile from the cabin. The trail up was too rough, even for four-wheel drive. I hiked the rest with my gear on my back. Sleeping bag, food, water filters, my .30-06, and a bunch of other supplies. Took longer than I expected. The trail had gotten overgrown, and I had to duck under branches and step around thick brush, all while trying to keep track of my bearings. When I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon and colder than I thought it would be. The cabin was still standing but looked a little more weathered than I remembered. One shutter was hanging off the side, and there were animal scratches on the doorframe. Probably a bear at some point. I checked the inside. Smelled like dust and old wood. Cobwebs in the corners. Dead leaves scattered across the floor. But nothing dangerous. I spent the first evening sweeping it out, stacking my gear, chopping a bit of firewood, and getting the small stove going. That night, I sat by the fire with a can of beans and a whiskey bottle. I didn't think about work. I didn't think about my ex. I just listened to the wind in the trees and the occasional owl hooting somewhere far off. No cell signal, no emails. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the wind moving through tall pine trees. The first 2 days were normal. I scouted around the area, followed a few deer trails, and found an old tree stand my uncle must have built years ago. I didn't see anything on the first day. On the second morning, I spotted a buck in the distance, but it moved too quickly for me to get a clean shot. Still, I felt good. There were signs of deer around. Droppings, fresh rubs on trees, tracks. But there was something about the tracks that felt off. They were wide, wider than any deer I'd tracked before, and sometimes I found them leading nowhere. Just a few steps in the mud and then nothing, as if the animal had vanished. I figured it was the way the leaves had fallen, or maybe something stepped onto a dry patch and kept moving. Animals don't follow human rules. I shrugged it off. But on the third night, something changed. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the cabin. Not an animal rustling in the bushes, Not the usual stuff you hear out in the woods. This was heavy, deliberate. I held my breath and sat up in my sleeping bag. The fire had died down to coals, and the whole cabin was dim. I stayed completely still. I didn't move, didn't even reach for my flashlight. The sound came again. Something walking past the window on the side. The crunch of leaves under slow, steady steps. It didn't feel like a bear. I've had bears wander around my tent before on past trips. This wasn't like that. It sounded like boots. But I knew I was supposed to be miles from the next nearest person. And nobody should have been out here. The steps stopped. I could hear my heart thudding in my ears. Then a light scratch across the wood wall. Just one slow drag of something sharp. Not claws, not random. It felt deliberate, like someone testing the wall. I stayed frozen for what felt like 20 minutes, maybe more. I didn't dare move. Eventually, I reached for the rifle beside my cot, slow and silent, and held it across my chest. I didn't load it. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, never came inside. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I fell asleep again sometime before dawn. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I found tracks, human boots, big ones, deep. Someone had walked around the cabin twice and stopped at the window. I checked the scratch marks. They were low, maybe knee height. It looked like someone had dragged a knife or something sharp along the wall. I kept telling myself it might have been an old trapper or someone lost in the woods. But I knew that was a lie. The tracks were fresh. The boots were modern. White, clean lines like they hadn't been walking all day, no scuffing or wear like a hiker would have. I followed them for a bit, but they just wandered off into thick brush and vanished. I didn't sleep the next night. I kept the fire going and stayed awake with my rifle. I kept the lantern off and just watched the shadows outside the windows. Nothing came. The next day, I packed my bag and hiked toward the ridge where I'd seen deer earlier in the week. I figured I'd try once more and then head back to the Jeep. About 2 hours in, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small deer, maybe a yearling, was hanging from a tree. Its legs were tied with rope, and its chest had been cut open clean. The insides were gone. Not torn, not eaten, removed. The head was twisted almost all the way around, and both eyes were missing. Clean cuts. It wasn't a kill by an animal. I'd seen what coyotes and cougars do. This was done by hands. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I turned back fast and kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel something watching me. That's not just paranoia. You know when something is watching you. Your skin gets tight. Your steps speed up. Your breathing changes. Back at the cabin, I sat for a long time with the rifle across my lap. I kept looking out the window, watching the trail I'd just come from. Nothing.
No birds.
No wind. Not even squirrels in the trees. The whole forest had gone quiet, like it was holding its breath. That night, I barricaded the door with firewood. I lit a second lantern and placed it by the window. I didn't care about using up fuel. I just wanted to see anything coming. I barely slept. Every little sound outside made me jump. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not walking this time, running. Fast. Past the cabin, through the leaves. Then silence. Then another set of steps, moving slower. Cautious. I didn't know if it was one person or two. I stayed behind the stove, crouched down with my rifle. The fire was still burning low. I watched shadows move across the window. Then I saw something that made my blood go cold. A face. It appeared just beyond the glass for half a second. Pale, wide eyes, no expression, just staring in. Then it moved away before I could react. I didn't leave the cabin the next day. I stayed inside all morning, all afternoon. I didn't even open the door. I just sat in the corner with my rifle and a coffee can to piss in. I heard nothing all day. Then at dusk, something hit the side of the cabin. Hard. like someone throwing a log against it. Then another hit near the back wall. I shouted, just instinct, even though I told myself I wouldn't make a sound. But there was no answer, only silence. Then a small rock came through the side window. Glass shattered all over the floor. That was it. I waited until first light, grabbed my bag, and left. I didn't clean anything up. I didn't check for more tracks. I just took my rifle and hiked straight to the Jeep. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to rest. I got in the Jeep and drove until I hit the highway. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. Not my boss, not my friends. I told them the trip was quiet, peaceful. I didn't even report the cabin break-in. 2 weeks later, I checked satellite maps online. I zoomed into the forest where the cabin was. I wanted to see if there was a trail camera or something nearby, but something caught my eye. There was a clearing a mile north of the cabin I hadn't noticed before. Big one. Looked like a man-made field. Zooming in, I saw what looked like a few small structures. Not houses, more like sheds or shacks.
No driveways.
No roads, just forest all around. I looked it up again 6 months later and the clearing was gone. Trees, no sign of any buildings, like it was never there. I haven't gone back to that area. I don't hunt anymore. I still have the rifle, still think about selling it, but I never do. Every now and then I'll hear something outside my house at night. A branch breaking, faint step, and for a split second, I'm back in that cabin, waiting for something I never wanted to meet. It was the summer of 2019 when I finally took time off from work. I was 32 then, working in insurance claims for a company based out of Leeds. I'd been burnt out for a while, tired of city traffic, sick of fluorescent lights, and just done with hearing people argue over things that didn't matter much to me. So when my cousin James told me about his friend's old hunting cabin in Northumberland that I could borrow for free, I said yes without a second thought. No rent, no people, no signal, just trees, quiet, and time. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from where I lived in Darlington. I packed up the basics, clothes, food for a week, gas canisters for the old cooker, my boots, my notebook, and a few books I knew I wouldn't actually read. I even brought my old camera, thinking maybe I'd get into photography again like I used to back in college. It had been a while since I did anything just for myself. I left early on a Tuesday morning, the roads mostly empty. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the buildings thinned out and the woods got thicker. The directions James gave me were pretty simple. Take the A68 north, turn off at a gravel road just past an old red barn, follow that road for about 5 miles, then park near the stream and walk the rest of the way in. The last leg of the road was rough, washed out in places, but I managed it. When I finally reached the stream, I parked beside a cluster of mossy rocks and stepped out. The air smelled damp and fresh, like it had just rained even though the sun was shining. I grabbed my backpack and started the walk. It was about a mile from the car to the cabin, a narrow footpath lined with ferns and nettles winding through tall trees. The forest felt old. Not creepy exactly, just untouched. Birds chirped overhead. My boots crushed dead leaves. I felt alone in the best way. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine and birch. It was older than I expected, more like a shed with a chimney, but it looked sturdy. The roof was intact, the windows were covered with shutters, and the front door had a heavy bolt on it. I unlocked it with the key James gave me. Inside was musty but dry. One small room, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a simple bed with a foam mattress. There was a propane stove against the wall and a tin bucket for water next to a small sink that drained outside. I dropped my bag, opened the windows, and let the light in. That first day was peaceful. I swept out the cabin, wiped off the surfaces, then walked around the clearing taking pictures. There was an old tree stump near the edge where someone had left an axe stuck deep into the wood. I tried to pull it out but couldn't. It had rusted into place. That night, I cooked some beans, sat out on the porch, and watched the sun go down. The forest turned dark slowly, the air cooling as crickets started chirping. I didn't build a fire. I didn't need to. I went to bed early, read a bit by torchlight, then fell asleep. The first couple of days went by slowly. I'd sleep late, make coffee on the stove, then go walking in the woods. I found a few old trails that wound off in different directions. Most didn't lead anywhere. Some faded out into thick undergrowth. I took photos of mushrooms, bark, fallen branches. Dumb stuff, really, but it helped pass the time. I saw no other people, no signs of life except for birds, squirrels, and one time a fox that darted across the path and disappeared into the trees. It was on the fourth day that I started noticing strange things. It began small. That morning, I woke up to find the axe had been pulled out of the stump. I tried it myself and couldn't budge it, but now it was leaning against the tree next to the stump, as if someone had used it and just left it there. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe an animal knocked it loose, though I knew that didn't really make sense. Later that afternoon, I went out walking again, following one of the side trails I hadn't tried yet. It went downhill deeper into the forest. About 30 minutes in, I came across a second clearing, smaller than the one around the cabin. In the middle was a pile of ash and some half-burnt sticks, an old fire pit. Someone had used it recently. The ground around it was trampled down, and there were scraps of food wrappers and a broken beer bottle. I crouched down and touched the ash. Still warm. Not hot, but warm. That meant someone had been there recently, within hours, maybe. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking I heard sounds outside the cabin. Snapping branches. Footsteps maybe, though it could have been a deer or just my imagination. I didn't have a gun, but I kept the hatchet from the woodpile near the bed. I stayed in the cabin all of the next day, not wanting to go far. Every now and then, I'd get up and peek through the window slats. The forest looked the same as ever, still, green, quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. By day 6, things got worse. That morning, I found boot prints outside the cabin door. Not mine. These were bigger and the treads were different. I wore hiking boots. These were more like work boots, deep lugs squared off. They came from the trees, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the woods. I followed them a short way, but they got lost in the undergrowth. When I got back, I locked the cabin door for the first time since I'd arrived. Later that day, I hiked out to where I'd parked the car, just to check on it. I don't know why, something in me felt like I should. When I got there, I found fresh mud smeared on the hood. Long, dark streaks like someone had run their hands across it. The passenger side mirror was cracked, hanging by a thread. I hadn't parked it like that. That's when it hit me that someone had followed me. Or maybe they'd already been out here when I arrived. I filled a jug with water from the stream, fast walked back to the cabin, and shut myself inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound outside made me freeze. I kept the lights off. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like gravel crunching, like footsteps coming up from the path. They stopped outside the cabin. Then nothing. I waited.
Nonak.
No voice. No sound of walking away. Just silence. Then, minutes later, the doorknob turned slowly. It rattled once, then again. It was locked. I sat there frozen, gripping the hatchet in both hands. Whoever it was didn't say a word. They just stood there for what felt like forever. Then the footsteps started again, fading off around the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I sat like that until the sun came up. In the morning, I opened the door and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed, more boot prints. I walked around the cabin slowly, looking for damage. At the back of the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. On the outside of the window shutter, someone had drawn a symbol in charcoal or ash. Just 3 lines, 2 vertical and 1 horizontal through the middle, like a rough letter H. It didn't look like anything specific, but it felt deliberate. Marking the cabin, marking me, that was it. I decided I was done. I packed up my gear and set out to hike back to the car. I had about half a mile to go when I heard movement behind me. Not an animal this time, real footsteps. I turned and saw nothing, but the sound came again. Someone following, just out of sight. I started walking faster. Then I heard a snap to my right. I stopped, spun around. Nothing again. But I was sure I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in the woods with me, watching, keeping just far enough away. When I finally saw my car, I almost cried. I sprinted the last stretch, tossed my bag into the back, and jumped into the driver's seat. I locked the doors, started the engine, and took off down the gravel road, the wheels slipping on the loose rock. I kept checking the rearview mirror. At one point, I thought I saw someone step out of the trees, but it was quick, just a shape, maybe a trick of the light. I didn't stop driving until I reached the A68 again. I pulled over at a service station, sat in the parking lot for nearly 30 minutes with the engine running. My hands were shaking. I kept looking at the rearview mirror like I expected someone to show up behind me. Back home in Darlington, I didn't tell anyone the full story. Just that the trip wasn't relaxing, that the place was a bit rough, and I didn't sleep well. I never mentioned the prints, the noises, or the symbol. I kept thinking maybe I overreacted. Maybe it was some local hiker or squatter. But it didn't feel random. It felt personal, like someone had waited for me, watched me. About a week later, James texted me asking how the cabin was. I told him it wasn't for me, too remote, that I left early. He texted back, "Weird, that place has been empty for years. My friend said no one's used it since his dad died. Even locals avoid it now. I still think about the symbol, about the footsteps, about the knob turning in the dark. Sometimes at night, I wake up thinking I hear that same gravel crunching outside my flat. I get up and check the door just to be sure. So far, there's been nothing, but I keep the hatchet by my bed, just in case." I still remember that week in August 2012 like it was yesterday. I had just turned 33, and for once in my life, I had nothing planned. No job deadlines, no family events, no one to report to. My old job working road construction in Kansas had ended abruptly after budget cuts, and I was taking a break before finding the next thing. I didn't have much, just a beat-up 2002 Ford Ranger, a couple coolers, some gear, and a habit of disappearing into the woods when I needed to clear my head. That week, I found myself driving through southern Oregon. I wasn't from there, never really spent time in that part of the country, but I'd always liked the look of it on the map. Just miles and miles of thick forest, 2-lane roads, and tiny towns you could miss if you blinked too long. The weather was dry and the skies were clear. I had a paper map spread out on the seat next to me with some back roads circled. I wasn't using GPS. I didn't even have cell service for most of the time I was up there. I was about 3 hours south of Eugene when I saw the turnoff. It was just a gravel path with a faded green sign that read Dry Pine Road. It wasn't even on my map. I almost kept driving, but something about it made me stop. I had time to kill and no one knew where I was anyway. I turned off the highway and drove slowly down the road. Gravel cracked under my tires, and thick trees leaned in from both sides. It was beautiful and a little eerie, like no one had used that road in a long time. I drove for maybe 30 minutes, winding deeper into the forest, when I spotted a clearing through the trees up ahead. There was something just barely visible through the brush, something man-made. I rolled up a little closer and parked just off the road. When I got out, I noticed the silence right away. No wind.
No birds.
Just that heavy, empty kind of quiet that makes you more aware of your breathing. I pulled my pack from the truck, grabbed a bottle of water, and hiked in through the brush toward the clearing. The cabin sat low and crooked among tall pines, maybe 70 yards off the road. It looked like no one had been there in decades. The roof sagged in the middle and the chimney was half collapsed. One window was boarded up with mismatched planks. The other was open, broken glass lining the sill like jagged teeth. The wood was weathered gray, covered in moss and old ivy. One side of the porch had caved in entirely. I stood there for a long while just staring at it. Something about the place pulled me in. I couldn't explain it. I've always liked old stuff, barns, fences, shacks, but this place felt different, like it was holding its breath. I walked up slow, testing the steps. Some were soft, but I made it to the porch without falling through. The front door was missing, just an empty frame leaning slightly to the right. Inside, it was dark but not pitch black. Enough light filtered through the trees to see where I was stepping. The air smelled of rot and dirt, but not in a strong way, just old. Dust floated in long beams of light that slipped through the broken boards overhead. The inside of the cabin was one open room with a stone fireplace on one end, a rusty metal-framed bed against one wall, and what looked like the remains of a kitchen near the back. There was a table in the center with a chair tipped over beside it. Some old jars lined the shelves, and I saw a few cans with labels I didn't recognize, brands I don't think they've sold in years. I didn't feel scared. Not yet. Just curious. I stepped inside and looked around slowly, checking each corner, each shadow. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. The cabin was empty, lifeless. Just a forgotten place in the middle of nowhere. I stepped back outside and sat on the edge of the porch to eat something. A granola bar, some beef jerky, and a warm bottle of water. I figured I'd camp nearby for the night, maybe head north the next morning. But something in me changed the longer I sat there. Maybe it was the quiet, or how the light hit the cabin just right, like it was hiding something in plain sight. I looked back inside again. I started wondering who built it, who lived there, why they left, why no one came back. I set up my tent about 50 feet away, just in the tree line. It was the safest spot I could think of that still gave me a view of the cabin. I wanted to watch it, for whatever reason. It was just this weird gut feeling that told me not to sleep too close to it. The sun dipped fast behind the trees. It got cold quick. I got a little fire going, ate another meal from a can, and zipped myself up in my sleeping bag. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the ceiling of my tent, but I know I didn't sleep easy. Every little sound outside made me freeze. Not animals, those I can recognize. This was different. Thumps, shuffles. Once I thought I heard something like wood bending or cracking slowly. I didn't go outside. I just lay there waiting for morning. When it finally came, I was up and moving fast. I packed my gear, stomped out the fire, and headed back to the cabin one last time before I left, just to see it in the daylight again. That's when I noticed something. There were footprints in the dirt near the porch. Bare feet, big wide prints. Not mine. I'd been wearing boots. These were clean, like they hadn't been there yesterday. The prints went from the edge of the porch around to the back of the cabin. I stood frozen, looking down at them, my heart suddenly pounding. I stepped around the side slowly, following the prints. Behind the cabin was a half-collapsed shed, more like a lean-to. The roof was almost touching the ground. I bent down and looked inside, and that's when I saw the cage. It was just sitting there in the dark. A square metal cage, maybe 4 feet tall. The door was hanging open, rusted and bent. Inside were chains bolted to the floor, and next to it a pile of bones. Not animal bones. I've hunted enough to know the difference. They were old, sun-bleached, small like from a child or a small woman. The dirt around the bones had been disturbed recently, like something or someone had moved them. I backed out slowly, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't run, but I moved fast, back to the truck. I tossed everything in the bed and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. Took a few tries to start. The gravel popped under my tires as I drove away, faster than I should have on a road like that. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't call the cops. I didn't even look back. For the next few weeks, I tried to push it out of my head. I told myself it was probably just a hunter's trap from years ago, or some crazy backwoods setup. Maybe the bones were fake. Maybe they were animal after all. But I know what I saw, and I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Clean, bare footprints, fresh in the dirt. That means someone had been there that night. Someone was watching. Someone walked right past my tent. A few months later, I read an article online about old sites in Oregon used for illegal confinement back in the 70s and 80s. People disappearing in remote areas never found.
No suspects.
Some cabins had cages, homemade cells, makeshift restraints. The authorities didn't talk much about it. I never found Dry Pine Road on any other map again. Every so often, I still dream about that cabin. The way it looked in the fading light. The silence. The prints. The bones. And the thing that bothers me most? There was a second cage in that shed. Empty. Door closed, but not locked. It was the end of September in 2017 when I decided to take a solo trip out to the countryside for a weekend. I'd been living in Bristol for a few years by then, working a boring IT job in the city, and the noise, the crowds, and even my flat, small walls were starting to get to me. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated. No phone signals, no deadlines. Just me, my backpack, some food, and a few books I'd been putting off reading. I found a cabin listing online that seemed perfect. It was deep in Gloucestershire, maybe about a 3-hour drive from my flat. The photos were a bit old, probably taken years ago, and the description was bare. Just a few lines saying it was a small off-grid cabin near an old graveyard, with a nearby trail and no electricity or running water. I figured that was part of the charm. It only cost £40 for the whole weekend. Cheap enough that I didn't ask too many questions. I packed up Friday morning, left around 10 a.m., and reached the area around 1 in the afternoon. I had to park my car at a dead-end dirt road and walk about 15 minutes through the woods. There was no proper trail, just grass, roots, and the occasional wooden stake with faded red paint to guide you. The forest was silent.
No birds.
No wind. Just my boots crunching over the undergrowth. I remember passing a wire fence, then a rusted metal sign with the words, "Private, enter at own risk," barely visible under peeling paint. It wasn't until I reached the clearing that I realized how close the cabin was to the graveyard. It wasn't like a normal graveyard with fences and rows of perfect headstones. This one looked forgotten.
Overgrown. No gates.
Just crooked stones sticking up out of thick weeds, scattered like someone had dropped them by accident. Some stones were leaning, others broken in half. I walked slowly past them, noticing the dates. Most of them from the late 1800s, some as early as 1842. No recent ones. The cabin sat about 30 feet from the edge of the graves. Small, weathered wood with a metal roof. A small porch in front, 2 steps leading up. No lights, no lock on the door, just a metal latch you could twist shut from the inside. I stepped in and smelled the age immediately. Old wood, dust, a hint of dampness. The cabin had one room, a cot against the back wall, a small table and chair, a metal stove with a pipe sticking through the ceiling.
No free.
Just a few shelves with old pots, some moldy cans, and a dented kettle. There was also a trapdoor near the bed, maybe to a crawl space or storage. It was quiet, which was what I wanted. I set my bag down, opened the windows for some air, and walked back out to look around. The forest behind the cabin ran thick for miles. I could see animal tracks in the dirt, some squirrel holes, and a dried-up creek bed. The graveyard felt heavier when I walked through it again. Some stones had carvings I couldn't read anymore. Others just had first names: Josephine, Samuel, Martha.
No surnames.
No flowers or signs of recent visits. I spent the rest of the day chopping some dry wood I found stacked behind the cabin, reading outside, and making a small fire pit. By dusk, I was tired enough to fall asleep without thinking too much. That first night was calm. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to a scratching sound. I figured it was a raccoon or something messing around outside. I didn't go look. By morning, the cabin was freezing. I made tea with my gas stove, read more, and hiked out past the creek bed. The forest was peaceful, but it had that strange feeling like something was always watching. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Things changed that second night. Around 9 p.m., it was already pitch dark outside. I had no lanterns, only my headlamp and a candle I lit on the table. I sat on the cot, reading by flashlight when I heard it again, that scratching sound. But this time it was under the floor, not outside, directly beneath me. I froze. The sound came and went. Slow, rough, like something dragging a nail along the underside of the floorboards. Not quick, not frantic, just steady. I stood up and listened. It stopped. I opened the trapdoor. Cold air rushed up, carrying a damp, earthy smell. I aimed my headlamp down and saw a dirt crawl space about 3 feet deep. Rocks, dust, a few old bricks. Nothing else. No animals, no movement. I shut the trapdoor and moved my bag against it. I stayed up late that night just listening. I didn't hear it again, but something in my brain wouldn't let me rest. I kept thinking about how close that graveyard was, how easy it would be for someone to bury something and never be found out here. Next morning, I decided I'd leave a day early. I packed up and stepped out around 8 a.m., but the forest was different. The red trail markers were gone. I walked back the way I came, but every turn looked wrong. I wasn't panicking yet, just annoyed. I figured I'd overshot a turn or looped wrong. I tried using the sun's position to reorient myself and eventually found a familiar rock near the creek bed. It had taken me nearly 2 hours. I knew then I wasn't staying another night, but as I got back to the cabin and started packing, something clicked in my head. I never opened the crawl space fully. I only glanced inside, and there was a part of me, a bad part, that wanted to look. Not for safety, not for any smart reason. Just curiosity, the worst kind. It was midday when I opened the trapdoor again and lowered myself inside. The ground was dry and cold. I crawled forward, past the dust and stone, and noticed something. An old wooden panel set into the back wall of the crawl space, like a little door maybe 2 feet wide. It didn't open easily. I had to pry at the edges with my knife. Behind it was another space maybe 4 feet deep. This one had something inside. A box. Just a plain, rectangular wooden box. Old.
No markings.
I pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of cloth. I unfolded it slowly and found what looked like a set of old clothes. Small, maybe for a woman or a child. Underneath, wrapped in wax paper, were yellowed pages. Handwritten. I unfolded the first one. It was dated 1903. It wasn't a journal or a story. It was a list. Names, ages, dates. Then one word next to each. Kept or buried. I flipped through more pages. More names. Some matched the stones outside. Josephine, Martha, Samuel. But the word kept showed up more than once. I put it back. Every hair on my body stood up. I suddenly felt like I had broken into something I wasn't supposed to see, like I had dug too deep. I shoved everything back, closed the panel, and got out. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the trapdoor blocked. But around 1:30 a.m., I heard something. It wasn't scratching. It was footsteps outside. Slow, heavy steps on the grass. Then on the porch. Then one creak, the top step. I stayed frozen in bed, holding my knife, not breathing. The footsteps didn't go away. They circled the cabin. Then silence. I didn't dare open the door until the sun came up. There were footprints in the dirt, bare feet, adult-sized. They led from the graveyard, around the cabin twice, then disappeared into the woods. That morning, I left without cleaning up. I didn't care about my leftover food or even the books I brought. I just followed my earlier trail out, marking trees as I went. I got to my car by noon. When I told the landowner by email that the cabin was in poor condition and that someone might be trespassing near the property, I got no reply. I checked the listing again a week later. It was gone. That was 8 years ago. I never went back, but sometimes I still think about that list. The way the word kept showed up so many times. And I wonder what it meant. And I wonder who, if anyone, was still out there, keeping watch on that graveyard. I've never booked another off-grid trip again. I took some time off in late October 2019 after a string of long, stressful weeks at work. I was 34 years old at the time, and the city had started to wear me down. I lived alone in a small apartment in Missoula, Montana. My dog, Riley, a 6-year-old yellow Labrador, was the only company I had most days. I had adopted him when he was just a puppy. He was calm, loyal, and loved the outdoors. I thought a solo cabin trip into the Bitterroot Valley would do both of us good. The plan was simple. Drive 2 hours south into the woods, stay for a week in an old hunting cabin a friend of a friend let me use. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. Just trees, crisp air, quiet, and maybe some early snowfall. I packed supplies, cans of chili, dry food, bottled water, extra batteries, a heavy coat, 2 flashlights, and a pistol I kept locked away at home. I wasn't expecting to use it, but it felt smart to bring it, just in case. I loaded the truck with everything I needed, and Riley jumped into the passenger seat like he knew this trip was something different. We arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, but scenic. Mountains rose on either side of the narrow gravel road as I followed my printed directions to a small turnout off the main trail. There were no other cabins nearby, and the closest town was 20 miles away. The cabin was deeper in the woods than I expected, hidden behind a cluster of pine and aspen trees, old but still standing strong. It had no electricity, only a wood stove for heat, and the windows were covered with metal shutters that I had to unlatch and push open. Inside, there was a single room with a cot, a table, a couple of chairs, and a shelf with rusted tools and old coffee cans filled with nails and screws. A short hallway led to a bathroom with a broken sink and a toilet that flushed only when you poured a bucket of water into it. I unpacked slowly. Riley sniffed every corner of the place and then lay down on the floor by the stove like he'd found his spot. I gathered some logs from the pile outside and lit a fire, careful to open the flue properly. The stove crackled to life, and soon the room filled with warmth. I felt relaxed for the first time in weeks. We had chili for dinner, and I read an old hunting magazine I found under the cot while Riley snored softly nearby. The first night passed quietly. I woke a few times to the sound of wind pushing through the trees and once to Riley growling softly in his sleep. But nothing felt off. The morning sun came through the cracks in the shutters, and the cold air bit at my face as I stepped outside. I boiled some instant coffee and drank it sitting on the small steps out front. There was no signal, no messages, no pressure. Felt good. For the next few days, we settled into a routine. I went on long walks through the woods, always carrying my pistol holstered on my belt. There were old trails out there, likely used by hunters or loggers decades ago, but now barely visible. I marked trees with orange tape so I wouldn't get turned around. Riley loved every second. He'd dart off into the brush chasing smells, then come running back when I whistled. We saw deer, a few hawks, and once, a fresh set of mountain lion tracks in the mud near a dry creek bed. That reminded me to keep Riley close. By the fourth day, something began to feel different. I don't know exactly when it started. Maybe it was subtle at first. On one of our afternoon hikes, I found Riley standing still, staring into the trees. He wasn't growling or barking, just frozen, ears up, staring hard at nothing I could see. I called him and he came, but kept glancing back over his shoulder like something had spooked him. That night, he stayed close to the stove instead of wandering the room like usual. His ears kept twitching like he was hearing things I couldn't. I chalked it up to wildlife. Maybe a raccoon or a fox had gotten close to the cabin. The forest was alive with sound at night. Branches moving, wind howling, sometimes what sounded like footsteps on dry leaves, though it was impossible to tell for sure. I tried not to overthink it, but by the fifth night, I knew something was off. Around 2 a.m., Riley woke me up. He was standing at the cabin door, his body stiff, tail low, and head tilted. He didn't make a sound, just stared at the door. I sat up in the cot and listened. First, I heard nothing. Then came the softest creak, like a footstep on a wooden porch. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. I reached for the flashlight and turned it on. I didn't open the door, just stood there in the dark with Riley beside me, listening. The sound didn't come again. After several long minutes, I locked the door's deadbolt, even though I doubted anyone would bother coming this far into the woods. Riley finally lay back down, but it took me hours to fall asleep again. The next morning, I found something strange. Just off the trail I usually took west of the cabin, I saw boot prints. Not mine. Someone had walked the trail recently, maybe the night before. They were deep, fresh, and heading in the direction of the cabin. I stopped and scanned the trees, heart beating hard in my chest. There were no houses around, no campsites, no reason for someone else to be out here. I looked for more tracks, but didn't find any. Riley sniffed the ground where the prints were, then looked at me, ears folded back. I turned around and went straight back to the cabin. I didn't go out again that day. I kept Riley inside, checked the window shutters, and made sure the pistol was loaded. I had no cell signal, no radio, no way to contact anyone. The nearest ranger station was probably an hour's drive away, and my truck was parked a quarter-mile down the hill from the cabin. I considered packing up and heading out, but part of me didn't want to panic. Could have been a hunter or someone passing through. Still, I stayed alert. That night, Riley didn't sleep. He stayed near the door, growling every so often under his breath. I kept the fire low and lay on the cot fully dressed. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. Not wind, actual footsteps. Someone was walking around the cabin. Slow, heavy steps crunching leaves and shifting dirt. Then it stopped. I didn't move. Riley growled, low and deep, and the hair on his neck stood up. I aimed the flashlight toward the window but didn't turn it on. The shutters were closed anyway. We waited. Maybe 10 minutes passed. Then came the soft clinking of metal, like someone trying the door handle. I held my breath. I reached for the pistol on the side table and stood slowly. There was no knock, no voice, just silence. Then the sound of footsteps again, this time moving away. I didn't sleep. I sat on the chair with the pistol in my lap and Riley curled up at my feet, still growling now and then. By morning, I had made my decision. We were leaving. I packed everything quickly, kept the gun on my hip, and stepped outside. It was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the cold morning air and the feeling of being watched. I scanned the treeline. Riley stayed right next to me, looking around with wide eyes. When we got down to the truck, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Someone had scratched the driver's side door with a knife, for deep slashes, long and deliberate. They didn't break the window or try to steal anything. It was a message. I opened the door fast. Riley jumped in, and I started the engine. I didn't stop until I reached the main road and got cell signal. I called the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office and reported what had happened. They said they'd send someone to check out the cabin, but that it was likely too remote for them to patrol regularly. Back in Missoula, I tried to forget about it. I told a few people what happened, and most said the same thing, probably a drifter, maybe a squatter. But it didn't feel random. That area was hard to reach. Whoever had been out there wasn't camping. They were watching, waiting. For weeks, Riley barked at the door every night. Even back in the city, he acted on edge. I stopped hiking alone. I sold the pistol and got a home security system instead. I didn't return to the cabin, and I never found out who had been walking around out there. But sometimes, when I can't sleep, I think about those boot prints, how fresh they were, how close they came to the cabin, and how they never led away. It was early October 2022 when I got the call. A neighbor up in Jackson County, North Carolina, told me that my ex-wife, Amelia, had passed in her sleep. She'd had a weak heart for years and lived alone in that old cabin she bought after we split. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 4 years. We weren't on bad terms when we divorced. No cheating, no screaming matches. We just drifted apart. I moved to Atlanta and worked construction jobs. She stayed up in the hills and ran a small online craft business. I knew she had some medical problems, but hearing she died like that, alone in her bed, hit me harder than I expected. She was only 44. She left behind no kids, no pets, not even a close friend. I was still listed on a few of her documents. That's how they found me. Apparently, the cabin was now mine. She never changed the deed after we divorced. I didn't really want anything to do with it, but I figured I should drive up there, see what was left, and clean it out before winter came. I left Atlanta in my old black pickup the next morning. Took 5 hours to get there. The air got cooler as I climbed the winding mountain roads. Leaves were turning gold and red. It was that strange time of year when the woods start to look empty but still carry the weight of summer's end. The cabin sat off a dirt road, a mile past the county line, hidden behind a rusted metal gate and thick tree cover. I hadn't been there since the year we signed the divorce papers. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. There was a moss-covered birdbath beside the porch. A couple of wind chimes hung crooked from the awning. The wood siding looked darker, probably from years of rain and mold. I parked in the gravel patch near the steps and just sat there for a while. The place was quiet, too quiet. You don't notice how much noise a city makes until you're somewhere like this. No cars, no humming power lines, no people yelling at each other. Just the rustling of dry leaves, the creaking of old trees, and every now and then, a bird. I grabbed a flashlight and my duffel bag from the truck and unlocked the front door with a key they had mailed to me. Took a hard shove to open it. The wood had swelled from years of dampness. Inside, the air smelled like old books and dried up flowers. Dust floated in the beams of light coming through the blinds. Her furniture was all still there. A faded couch, coffee table, the shelves we built together back in 2008. A photo frame still sat on the mantel with a picture of the two of us smiling beside a creek. I picked it up and stared at it for a long time. That night, I stayed in the cabin. I hadn't really planned to, but I was tired, and the sun was setting fast. I set my bag down in the spare room. The power still worked somehow. So did the tap water, but the heat didn't. The furnace in the basement must have died years ago. I built a fire in the old brick fireplace. I cooked a can of chili on a small stove and sat on the floor while I ate. The silence was thick. Every small sound echoed. A tree branch tapping against the siding sounded like a knuckle on a door. The creak of floorboards felt like footsteps. My phone had 1 bar of service, barely enough to load a weather app. Forecast said rain through the night. Started around midnight. I was lying in the old bed under a musty wool blanket when the sound of rain began to hit the roof. Slow at first, then heavier. I could hear wind moving through the trees like a slow breath. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but something kept me awake. It wasn't fear, not at first. It was a strange discomfort, like the place didn't want me there. I got up and walked around with my flashlight. The roof dripped in a few corners. Water ran down a crack near the window frame. I walked into Amelia's old room. It was still full of her things. Makeup brushes on the dresser. Handmade candles stacked in boxes. A robe still hanging on the door. I looked around slowly. There was an old notebook on the nightstand. I flipped it open. Inside were pages and pages of scribbled journal entries, grocery lists, dreams. But the last dozen pages caught me off guard. They were all about someone or something in the woods. Saw him again near the shed. He's not a neighbor. He doesn't belong here. Last night I heard him walk around the house. Didn't sleep. Too scared. I stopped reading after that. I didn't want to keep going. I closed the notebook and set it back where I found it. I went outside. I don't know why. Maybe to see if I could prove to myself there was no one there. The rain had softened a little, but the wind kept blowing leaves across the ground. My boots sank into the wet dirt. I walked past the side of the cabin with my flashlight aimed low. That's when I noticed something odd. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the woods to the side window, then back again. They were shallow, like someone in sneakers. I followed them a little, maybe 20 feet into the tree line before the mud dried out. I stood still for a moment. All I could hear was the wind and a few distant owl calls.
No voices. No lights.
No other sounds. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire with a kitchen knife nearby, staring into the dark. Morning came slow, cloudy and cold. I made some coffee with bottled water and an old percolator I found in the cupboard. Then I went outside to see if the prints were still there. They were gone. Rain must have washed them away. I decided I'd pack up some of her things, mostly just documents and photos, and head back to Atlanta by the afternoon. But before I left, I figured I should check the shed out back. That's where she said she saw him, according to her journal. The shed was about 50 yards behind the cabin, half hidden by brush. The door had a rusted lock that had been broken clean off. I opened it with my foot. It stank of old gasoline and wet wood. Inside were tools, crates, and a few bags of fertilizer. Nothing strange, nothing human. But behind some boards, I found a pair of boots. They were muddy, newer than the rest of the junk. Too new. And next to them, a crumpled bag of fast food. The receipt dated just 3 weeks before she died. I stood there in silence. Someone had been using this shed. Someone who hadn't lived there. My pulse started to rise. I backed out of the shed and looked around.
No sounds.
No movement, but I could feel it again, that same discomfort. The same sense that someone was nearby, watching. I hurried back inside and started grabbing my things. I threw her photo albums, laptop, and a few boxes into the truck. Then I went back to lock the front door behind me. But something stopped me at the hallway. There were wet boot prints on the floor, leading from the back door to the center of the living room. I froze. My heart was thumping so hard I could barely breathe. I walked to the back door, still locked. No signs of forced entry, but those prints were real. I crouched and touched one, still damp, fresh. I didn't check the rest of the house. I didn't want to. I got out fast. I got in my truck, backed out of the gravel, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. My tires kicked up leaves and rocks. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Later that night, in a cheap motel room just outside Asheville, I sat on the bed and stared at the notebook I took from her room. I read the last entry. If something happens to me, it wasn't natural. Someone has been watching. I feel it. Every night. The handwriting trailed off at the end, like she had been interrupted. I thought about calling the sheriff, but what would I say? That a dead woman's journal said someone was watching her? That I found boots and food in an old shed? I didn't call. I drove back to Atlanta the next morning and locked that notebook in a drawer. I couldn't stop thinking about the prints, the boots, the broken lock, the feeling I had out there in the woods. Like something wasn't right, like something was unfinished. A week later, I got an email. It was from a random account. No name, no message, just an attachment. A photo. It showed the front of the cabin, taken at night. The lights were on, and I was in the window, but I'd never seen anyone take that picture. I deleted the email, changed my number, sold the truck. I never went back. I had the cabin signed over to the county, and sometimes, when I'm awake at night, I wonder who was living in that shed. I wonder who sent the photo, and I wonder if Amelia really died in her sleep, or if someone made sure she did. My name's Chris, and back in 2016, I made the worst mistake of my life. One I still carry every single day. I was 34 then, living a pretty average life working maintenance at a school in northern Arkansas. I wasn't married, no kids. My folks had passed away years earlier, and my older brother moved out west for good. I didn't have much tying me down, which is probably why I thought it was a good idea to revisit something from my past that should have stayed buried. When I was a teenager, maybe 15 or so, my grandfather built this small cabin way out in the Ozark National Forest. It wasn't big or fancy, just one room, some old furniture, and a propane heater. No running water, no cell service, nothing. It was his escape from the world. After he died, the place just sat there, slowly falling apart, untouched for nearly 18 years. I don't know what got into me. Maybe I was feeling nostalgic. Maybe I was just looking for some peace and quiet after dealing with a long winter and the mess at work. I'd just gotten out of a messy breakup too, so my head was all over the place. Anyway, I found the key in a drawer at my place, loaded up my truck with supplies, and made the 3-hour drive into the mountains. The road to the cabin was mostly forgotten. Half of it was overgrown with weeds, the gravel washed out from years of rain. I had to park a quarter-mile away and walk the rest with a backpack and a jerry can of gas. The deeper I hiked, the more I started remembering old details. How the trees always made it feel like dusk, even at noon. How the air always smelled like moss and wet bark. How the cabin just sat there like it didn't belong. When I finally saw it through the brush, it was like stepping back in time. Same weathered boards, same leaning porch, same squeaky screen door barely hanging on by a hinge. The windows were dust-covered, and vines had wrapped halfway around the sides, but the structure was still solid. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, like I was waiting for someone to tell me not to go inside. I wish someone had. I pushed open the door, and the inside was just as I remembered, just dustier, darker, colder. The old bed frame was still there, mattress sunken in the middle. The shelves still held a few rusted cans of beans and peaches. In the corner sat my grandpa's old hunting chair, still draped in the same moldy wool blanket. I spent the rest of the day cleaning out cobwebs and setting up my stuff. I had canned food, a little stove, sleeping bag, flashlight, and a couple jugs of water. It wasn't comfortable, but I didn't come for comfort. That first night, it was dead quiet. Not peaceful quiet, more like everything out there was holding its breath. I laid in the sleeping bag, listening to the wind against the walls, the groaning of old wood shifting with the cold. I kept telling myself it was just the age of the cabin, but something about that silence felt wrong. You ever notice how some places just feel like they're watching you? That's what it felt like in that cabin. Next morning, I took a short hike to a nearby creek to wash up. On my way back, I noticed something off near the side of the cabin, boot prints. Not mine. Too big. Deep too, like the person had been standing there a while. I crouched down to get a better look, trying to figure out if they were old or fresh. The ground was still a bit soft from rain earlier in the week, and the edges of the print were sharp. That meant recent, like last night or even that morning. I felt a twist in my gut. I looked around, listening. Nothing. No birds. No wind. Not even the distant sound of squirrels. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. No movement. No one calling out. Just stillness. I circled the cabin to see if there were more tracks, but I didn't see any. Just that one spot, right where someone would stand if they were looking into the window. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with my back to the wall and a hatchet in my lap. Every creak in the wood made my neck tense. A couple times I thought I heard twigs snapping out in the trees, but I couldn't be sure. There was no moon, and the lantern I had barely lit 5 feet in front of me. I ended up dozing off sometime around 4 a.m., with my knees still pulled to my chest. By the third day, I was ready to leave, but I felt like I needed to figure out who had been near the cabin. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. So I stayed. I kept looking for more signs. Footprints, broken branches, anything. But the only weird thing I found was a torn piece of denim on a fence post about 60 yards out. It looked fresh. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just like someone caught their jeans on the barbed wire and kept moving. That night, I made sure the door was locked and jammed a chair under the handle. I kept the lantern off to save fuel. Just sat in the dark listening. Around midnight, I heard something. Not inside, outside. Something moving around the back of the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath. The footsteps circled to the side window, the same one where I'd seen the boot prints. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Just stared at the edge of the wall, waiting for a shadow to appear. And then, nothing.
No knock. No scratching.
Just silence again. It was almost worse than if someone had tried to break in. I stayed frozen for hours. When the sun finally started to rise, I crept to the window. There was nothing there, no one in sight. But I did find something new. Stuck between the frame and the window pane was a strip of black tape, almost invisible unless you were looking right at it. I peeled it off and saw it was holding something flat against the glass. An old photograph. A black and white shot of the cabin from decades ago. The weird part, there was someone standing in the photo way off in the trees, almost hidden. You could barely make them out, but they were definitely facing the camera. I never saw that photo before in my life. That was it for me. I packed everything in 15 minutes and left. I didn't bother to clean up or check for more clues. I just wanted to get the hell out. But when I hiked back to where I parked the truck, my stomach dropped. The front windshield was cracked, deep enough that it spidered out halfway across. And stuck under the wiper blade was another photo. This one was newer, color, taken from a distance, of me, standing on the cabin porch the day I arrived. I didn't sleep the entire drive home. I kept checking the rear view, looking for headlights that weren't there. I went straight to the police when I got back, showed them the photos, told them everything. They made a report but didn't seem to take it seriously. No real crime had been committed, they said. Just some weird backwoods trespassing. They said it was probably a hunter or a prankster. But no one followed up. No one visited the site. I moved 3 months later. New job, new state, different kind of life. But I still lock every door, double-check every window. I still get up at 3 a.m. and walk the perimeter of wherever I'm staying. I still keep those photos hidden in a box because throwing them away feels wrong, like it'll invite something worse. I never found out who was watching me. Maybe it was someone who used to live there. Maybe it was someone who never left. All I know is they knew I was coming. They were waiting, and they wanted me to know it. That cabin is still out there, probably falling apart by now. But if you ever find yourself hiking deep in the Ozarks and you see an old structure through the trees, keep walking. Don't look inside. Don't touch anything. And whatever you do, don't stay the night, because someone might be watching you, just like they watched me. I was 35 the first time I traveled alone into the Amazon. It wasn't some bucket list adventure or some spiritual awakening story. I wasn't trying to find myself or unplug from society. I went because I had to get away. A few things back home in Montana had unraveled fast. My small furniture business went under. I owed money I couldn't pay back. My ex-wife, whom I still somehow cared for, got engaged to a guy I used to call a friend. So I sold the last few tools I had left, took what money I had in my savings, and booked a one-way ticket to Brazil. My plan was simple. I'd go deep into the forest for a while, spend a few weeks away from everything and everyone. I read about an old hunter's cabin listed on a small Brazilian message board. The guy who posted about it said it was rarely used anymore, located on the edge of a dried tributary off the Rio Madeira, and could be rented for cheap if you didn't mind being totally alone. The idea sounded perfect. I flew into Manaus and took a bus down to a dusty little village called Novo Esperança. From there, a local fisherman took me 2 hours upriver in his leaky aluminum boat and dropped me off at the bank of a narrow creek. He pointed into the jungle, said something I didn't understand, and motored off. I followed the muddy trail he pointed to, hauling my backpack, a 20-liter jerry can of water, and a second duffel bag full of canned food. I walked for a little over an hour before I saw the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The cabin stood on short stilts, probably to avoid flooding during the rainy season. Its roof was made from rusted corrugated metal, and vines had crept up the corners like slow, green fire. The door leaned slightly off-center. The windows didn't have glass, just wooden shutters nailed from the inside. Still, it had a roof for walls and a floor that wasn't mud. Inside, it smelled like wet dirt and dead bugs. There was a cot on one side with a worn wool blanket and a shelf on the back wall where someone had left an old pan, a can opener, and a few yellowing books in Portuguese. I dropped my bags, swept out a few dead beetles with a branch, and decided it would do. For the first 3 days, everything was quiet. I spent my time cleaning the cabin, fishing off the bank near the dry creek, and sitting on a log listening to the buzzing of insects and calls of distant birds. I cooked beans over a small camp stove and ate from the same dented tin plate every meal. I read 2 chapters of one of the books even though I didn't understand most of it. Felt good not having to talk, answer texts, or think about anything back home. On the 4th morning, I hiked farther up the creek to see how far it ran. It was mostly dry, but still soft and slick in places. About an hour in, I found something odd. There was a rusted machete sticking out of the mud, the handle wrapped in cracked red tape. It had been there a long time, but the blade still looked sharp enough to cut. Kept it. That night, a storm rolled in, came fast. The sky turned gray in the early afternoon, and by sunset, the wind had picked up so bad it rattled the roof sheets. Rain pounded on the metal like fists. I sat inside, staring at the shutters as they banged in the wind. The sound was deafening, but I didn't feel scared, at least not yet. The power was already non-existent out there, so I lit a small candle and laid on the cot, listening to the rain and letting the wind carry me off to sleep. Somewhere around midnight, I woke up to a sound that wasn't the storm. It was softer, more solid. A dull thump, then another, and another. It wasn't wind. It wasn't thunder. It was something hitting the ground right outside the cabin. I sat up slowly and held my breath. I heard it again, something dragging, something heavy, then silence. I didn't move for the rest of the night. The storm ended around dawn, and the forest was dead quiet. I stepped outside barefoot, careful not to make noise. The ground around the cabin was soaked, and the air felt thick like soup. I circled around slowly. About 10 feet from the back of the cabin, I saw it. A large muddy trail led from the jungle straight toward the side of the cabin. Something had been dragged. I followed the trail with my eyes until it ended at a strange mound, half covered in leaves and wet debris. I took the machete and used the blade to lift the pile gently. What I saw underneath made me stumble back and drop the blade. It was a human body, a man. He looked about 40, maybe older. His face was bloated and pale, and his eyes were open. His shirt was ripped down the middle, and something had torn into his chest. Probably animals. One of his boots was missing. His hand was curled around a broken branch like he'd tried to grab it before dying. I stood there for a long time, not moving. My stomach felt like it was filled with concrete. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a phone, no signal, no radio. The fisherman wouldn't be back for at least a week, and even then, only if he remembered. I didn't know who the man was, where he came from, or how long he'd been dead. I ran back inside and stayed there the rest of the day. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what would make someone end up dead out here. Maybe he was a poacher. Maybe he got lost. Maybe someone brought him here on purpose. On the 6th day, I forced myself to go back out. I figured I needed to bury the body. I couldn't just leave it to rot 10 feet from where I slept. I found a flat area near the trail where the ground was softer and started digging with the machete and an old frying pan. Took me most of the day. By evening, I wrapped the body in a tarp I found under the cabin, dragged it to the hole, and buried him. I marked the spot with a stick, though I didn't write anything on it. I didn't know his name. I didn't want to know. That night, I heard the dragging sound again. My body locked up instantly. I laid on the cot with the candle out, my heart beating so loud I could hear it. The sound came from behind the cabin again. Slow, deliberate, thump, slide, then nothing. I wanted to believe it was just a boar, maybe a jaguar, but I knew what I heard, and animals don't drag things like that. At sunrise, I ran back to where I buried the man. The grave was untouched, not a single mark, not even a footprint, but that trail, the drag trail, was fresh again, just like before, from the jungle right to the edge of the cabin. I was being watched. I started seeing things after that. Small things at first. A can from my food stash missing. A dirty footprint near the creek that didn't match mine. My bag shifted slightly from where I left it. Then, one morning, I found the machete gone. Just gone. I hadn't touched it since the burial. I stopped sleeping. I stopped fishing. I just sat in the corner of the cabin with a metal pan in my hands and waited. By day 11, I was completely paranoid. I considered leaving, but I didn't know the way back, and the jungle around the cabin was too thick. Plus, the river path was dry. I was stuck. That afternoon, I went back into the forest, past the grave, and followed the dragging trail into the trees. It went on for about 40 yards, then curved into a thicket. I pushed through. There was another cabin, smaller, older, covered in moss. The door was gone, and the roof had collapsed in the back. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but inside, there were signs of life. Fresh footprints in the dirt, pile of fish bones, a torn red jacket hanging from a nail. There was also a bag, not mine, a green military duffel. I opened it and found a hunting knife, a water bottle, a half-eaten ration, and a notebook wrapped in plastic. The notebook was in English. It belonged to someone named Alan Mercer, American, age 42. The first few pages were about his arrival, his reason for being there, similar to mine. He wanted to disappear for a while. He mentioned renting the same cabin I stayed in. The entries were short and nervous. The last 3 pages got stranger. One entry talked about hearing things dragging at night. Another said, "Saw someone watching me from the woods, but when I shouted, they ran." The final page said, "Someone tried to get in last night. I saw their hand reach through the shutter. Not an animal, a man. I'm going to follow the trail tomorrow." That was the last entry. I dropped the notebook and ran back to my cabin. That night, I didn't hear dragging. Instead, I heard something knock on the door, just once, soft, like someone tapping. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then I heard footsteps walking away into the woods. Slow, calm. I waited until morning and packed everything. I decided to walk. I didn't care how lost I got or how many days it took. I'd follow the creek until I found the river or died trying. It took me 3.5 days of walking, barely sleeping, rationing water and food. On the 4th day, I stumbled out of the trees onto a wide dirt road. A logging truck passed, stopped, and picked me up. I didn't tell the driver anything. Not about the body, not about the cabin, not about the other man. When I got back to Manaus, I took the first flight home. That was 2 years ago. I still don't sleep right. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear something dragging outside the house. A slow thump, then silence. A week ago, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was the machete. Same red tape on the handle. Same nicks in the blade. No note, just the blade. I haven't left the house since, and I'm not going back to the forest. Ever. It was October 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything. I was 34 at the time. I had just gotten laid off from my job at a construction supply warehouse outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd worked there for over 7 years, and when they cut me loose, it felt like someone just hit pause on my life. I didn't have a family, no wife or kids, just a small rented apartment, a rusted old truck, and a dog named Hank who'd been with me since I found him limping along a roadside in Utah 5 years earlier. After a couple of weeks of just sitting around doing nothing but watching the ceiling fan spin and drinking too many beers, I needed to get out. I remembered a spot way out in the Kaibab National Forest that my uncle used to take me hunting when I was a teenager. There was a small cabin out there, old, wooden, and barely standing back then. We never stayed in it. It was more of a landmark, but I figured if it was still there, it might be the kind of quiet place I needed. So I packed up the truck with what I had: tent, some canned food, a small cooler, tools, flashlight, water jugs, and a bolt-action rifle just in case, and I drove out of town. Hank sat in the passenger seat like always, head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. The drive took about 4 hours, most of it along bumpy forest roads that had more rocks and holes than actual dirt. By the time I reached the turnoff near what used to be Dry Creek Road, it was late afternoon. The sun was low and threw long shadows through the trees. I left the truck parked off the trail and hiked the last mile in with Hank. The trees were thick, and the only sounds were my boots on the ground and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere off in the woods. The cabin was still there, surprisingly. The roof sagged badly on one side, the porch had collapsed inward, and the door was hanging crooked on its hinges. But it was standing. It was colder than I expected up there, and a light breeze made the trees whisper. I set up my tent about 30 feet behind the cabin, where the ground was flatter. I didn't want to stay inside the cabin itself. It looked ready to fall over if you leaned on it. That first night, I lit a small fire and sat on a log, just listening to the quiet. Hank sniffed around but stayed close. There was no cell service, no lights, no sound of cars or people. It was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I walked around to get a better look at the area. I hadn't been out there in over 20 years. The creek that used to run through the edge of the clearing was bone dry, just a narrow trench filled with leaves and branches. I checked the cabin closer and found some old gear inside. Rusty pots, a broken lantern, and a dusty sleeping bag with holes chewed through it. There were boot prints on the wooden floor too, not fresh, but not ancient either. I didn't think much of it. Hunters came through that area now and then. I spent most of that day gathering wood and fixing up the fire pit. I also started making a rough table out of some rotting planks from the porch. I figured I'd be there for a while and wanted a place to sit and cook instead of eating on the ground. I stayed busy. That night was colder, and the wind picked up. I bundled myself and Hank in the tent, zipped it all the way, and passed out. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire outside had burned down to nothing, and it was pitch dark. Hank was up too, sitting at the edge of the tent with his ears perked, listening. I heard something then, soft, slow crunching in the leaves. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't fast or erratic like a raccoon or deer. It was steady, slow steps. I stayed still, held my breath. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then nothing. Total silence for about a minute. Hank growled low and deep. Then the steps moved again, this time farther away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I went out to check. I walked in the direction I thought the steps went. About 50 yards from the tent, in a patch of moss and fallen needles, I found prints. Shoe prints, not boots, sneakers. The tread was worn, but the heel was narrow. Someone had been walking around out there at night, and they weren't camping. I didn't like it. I kept my rifle close the rest of the day and stayed near camp. I figured maybe it was someone passing through, just looking around. There were weird folks in the woods sometimes. I'd met a few during my uncle's hunting trips, hermits, off-gridders, drifters, usually harmless. That night, I didn't light a fire. I wanted to be quiet and harder to spot. I sat inside the tent with the zipper halfway down so I could peek out. I waited until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. Nothing happened. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were scratch marks on the cabin door. Long, deliberate lines carved into the wood. 5 of them, too far apart for an animal. Too clean. I looked closer and saw the edges were chipped like someone had done it with a knife or a nail. Now I was done pretending it was nothing. I thought about leaving, but I told myself not to panic. Maybe some teenager had been fooling around. I still had the rifle. Hank was a good guard dog. I told myself I'd wait one more night. If anything else happened, I'd pack up at first light and go. I set tripwires around the clearing. Nothing fancy, just fishing line with some empty cans tied to it, stretched between branches about a foot off the ground. I also placed small stones on the steps of the cabin and around the tent, so I'd know if someone stepped near. That night was quiet at first, but around 2:30 in the morning, I heard a can rattle, then another. Hank growled and stood. I grabbed the rifle and sat up slowly. I could hear someone moving outside the clearing, slow again, just like before. Then it went quiet. I didn't move for over an hour, just sat there with the barrel of the rifle across my knees, eyes wide, listening. In the morning, the cans were knocked over behind the tent. One of the tripwires had been cut clean, not broken, cut like with a blade. I packed up. Took me an hour to load everything. I was rushing, but I kept looking around constantly. Hank was anxious too, tail low, pacing. I started back toward the truck. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I saw something that stopped me cold. In the dirt, just off the trail, was a pile of small, torn-up pieces of fabric. My old shirt, one I'd used as a rag, that I'd left on the cabin steps 2 days earlier. It had been ripped to shreds and placed in a neat little pile. And on top of it was a dead squirrel, its belly split open, like a warning, like someone had been watching me. I moved faster, heart pounding. When I got to the truck, I found scratches on the passenger side window, the kind made by dragging something sharp across it. Not enough to break the glass, but enough to mark it. Someone had been there, watching, close enough to touch the truck. I drove the hell out of there without stopping. Didn't look in the mirror. Didn't stop until I was almost back in town. I reported it to the local ranger station, but they didn't find much. Said maybe it was a squatter. Said the cabin had no official owner listed anymore. They took my report, but I never heard back. I never went back to that spot again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but someone had been watching, quietly, carefully, moving around the edges, cutting lines, leaving messages, and they knew where I slept. They waited until nightfall. They got close without making noise. They knew I had a gun. They didn't care. That's the part that still gets me. Whoever it was didn't want to hurt me right away. They just wanted me to know they were there, waiting, and that somehow was worse. It was August of 2019 when I decided I needed a break from everything. I had just turned 32, and between my job at the machine shop in Grand Junction and the stuff going on with my brother's legal mess, I was worn out. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to look at my phone or think about work or court dates. I just wanted to be out there somewhere quiet, where no one could bother me. That's when I remembered the old hunting cabin my dad used to talk about. He never used it much after the early 2000s. It was a little 2-room thing built way out past Rifle, Colorado, in the middle of the flattop wilderness. My Uncle Dave owned the land back then, and I guess they built it with leftover wood and scraps from his construction jobs. It didn't have power or plumbing, but I wasn't looking for comfort. I just wanted peace. I took Friday off and told my boss I'd be gone through Monday. I loaded up my old Tacoma with enough canned food, water jugs, some basic tools, and my Ruger 10 of 22, just in case I saw anything worth shooting, or in case some animal got too curious. I also brought my dad's old camping stove, a cooler with some ice and meat, and a few blankets. I even packed a small axe and a steel shovel just like he used to. I knew the road out there was trash, so I wasn't expecting a smooth ride. I left around 6 a.m. Friday morning. By the time I got to the last marked road, I had to use an offline GPS map on my phone to follow the old dirt path up the mountain. The deeper I got, the worse the trail became. It wasn't even gravel near the end. Just uneven, dry earth with deep tire ruts and rocks poking up. Pine trees pressed in on both sides, and I kept having to duck branches scraping my windshield. I hadn't seen another car for more than an hour. The trail eventually opened into a clearing. The cabin was still standing, a little tilted now, and covered in moss and dirt, but it was there. I parked under a tall spruce and took a good look around. Felt forgotten.
No tire marks. No litter.
Just that faded wood structure and the thick, quiet woods around it. The air smelled like pine and old bark. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I unloaded my gear and went inside. The front door creaked bad but still worked. The cabin had one main room with a stone fireplace and a back room that used to be where my dad stored hunting gear. Most of the stuff was gone. Just old nails in the walls and a broken stool tipped over in the corner. A rusted oil lamp sat on the windowsill. I found a few mouse droppings, but nothing alive. I set up my sleeping bag in the corner farthest from the door and kept the gun next to it. I started a small fire in the fireplace just before the sun went down and cooked a can of beans on the stove. I ate with my back to the wall, listening to the woods outside. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't that it was silent. It was just off. I grew up hunting and fishing in Colorado. You learn what a quiet forest sounds like. But this was something else.
No rustling, no birds, no bugs.
Like the whole area was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it. I told myself maybe it was just too dry for the animals to be moving around. Still, I didn't sleep much that first night. Every time a gust of wind brushed the trees, I thought it was footsteps. I'd sit up, holding my breath, hand on my rifle, and wait for the sound again. But it never came. Eventually, sometime around 3 a.m., I passed out. The next morning, I walked the edge of the clearing to get my bearings. There was a faint trail leading down toward a small stream, maybe a quarter-mile out. I took my water jugs and filled them, keeping an eye out for any fresh prints. Deer, elk, anything, but the dirt was dry and hard. Nothing had passed that way in a while. I spent the afternoon cleaning out the inside of the cabin. I swept dirt into the corners and nailed a sheet over the busted back window using some scrap plywood I found leaning against the shed out back. The shed was locked with an old bolt that had rusted shut, but I forced it open with the back of the axe. Inside were a few broken traps, some rusted tools, and an old rake. Nothing helpful. By evening, I had calmed down some. I started thinking maybe the first night was just nerves. I made a small fire outside this time, sat on a log, and watched the sun drop below the trees. The sky turned orange and pink, and the shadows crept in slow. Still no birds, still no crickets. Then, just as it went dark, I thought I saw something move across the tree line, maybe 100 feet away. A shadow. Fast. Too fast for a deer. And it didn't move like an animal. It moved like a person. I stared so hard my eyes hurt, but I didn't see anything else. I stood up, holding my light, and scanned the woods with my beam. Nothing. I called out a warning, more for my own nerves than anything. But silence answered back. I didn't sleep again that night. I kept the fire going inside and stayed in the corner, gun across my chest. At one point, just after midnight, I heard something scrape the side of the cabin. Just once. Not a branch swaying in wind. A drag, like a boot or a tool brushing along the wood. I froze. The fire flickered low, and my eyes strained at the front door. Nothing came in, but I didn't move until dawn. By morning, I was already debating packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting.
No footprints.
No real proof. Maybe it was just my imagination or some mountain animal acting strange. I stepped out around 8 a.m., and that's when I saw it. A single boot print, in the dirt, right next to the shed. It wasn't mine. I wore hiking boots, and this one was different. Narrower. Looked like some worn-out work boot, based on the tread. And it was deep. Someone heavier had been standing there. I walked a full circle around the cabin. Just the one print, nothing else. No second footstep, no trail. Like someone had stepped into the dirt and vanished. That's when I knew I wasn't alone out here. I packed my things fast. I kept my rifle slung over my shoulder, safety off. I had one more can of food, but I didn't bother heating it. I shoved everything in the truck and started her up. The engine sputtered once, choked, and then caught. I backed up, turned toward the trail, and slammed the brakes. The road was blocked. Somehow, a downed tree was now laying across the narrow dirt path, right where I had come in. It hadn't been there before. It was too thick for me to move alone, and I hadn't heard a crash in the night. Someone put it there. My stomach dropped. I jumped out and looked closer. The trunk was old, but fresh cuts lined the bark, like someone had used a handsaw. I ran back to the shed, grabbed the dull axe, and started hacking at the thinner end. It took me nearly an hour, but I cleared just enough to squeeze the Tacoma through if I angled it right. When I turned back to the cabin, I swear I saw the curtain in the back window move. But I didn't go check. I got in and drove. Fast, bouncing hard over the ruts. Branches snapped against my windshield. My arms were shaking, and I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was no one. I didn't stop until I hit the paved highway. I pulled into a gas station and just sat there for a while. When I finally checked my phone, I saw I had dozens of missed calls and messages. My brother had been arrested the night I left. My boss needed me back. Everything was falling apart, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. I waited a few weeks before I told anyone what happened. When I finally told my dad, he went real quiet. He looked at me hard and said something I'll never forget. That cabin should have stayed forgotten. I never asked him what he meant. I didn't want to know. I haven't been back since. I heard that part of the mountain burned in the wildfires the next year. Maybe the cabin's gone now. Maybe the person who watched me is gone too. Or maybe they just moved deeper into the woods, waiting for someone else to find that place. I don't tell people this story because I think they'll think I'm crazy. But I know what I saw. I know that footprint was real. I know that tree didn't fall by itself. And I know I wasn't alone out there. That place wasn't haunted by ghosts or spirits. It was haunted by someone real. And I don't ever want to find out who. I was 36 when I drove up to that isolated cabin in northern Idaho. It was late October 2014. The weather had just started turning cold, but the leaves hadn't all dropped yet. I had rented the place for 3 weeks through a local listing that didn't ask many questions. It was one of those leave the money under the mat kind of deals, and I needed something like that. I was coming off a hard few months. I quit my job in Boise, burned through too much savings, and I just wanted to get off the grid and sort my head out. I packed light, just canned food, propane, sleeping gear, basic tools, and my notebook. No phone, no internet. That was the point. I didn't even tell anyone exactly where I was going. The drive up took about 6 hours, mostly on empty roads winding through thick forests. The cabin wasn't marked on any map. I had handwritten directions I'd gotten through email weeks before. It sat about 4 miles off the main road, down a dirt trail that was rutted with dried mud and old tire tracks. There was no sign, just a narrow cut in the trees. The cabin itself was small, wooden, square, with a slanted tin roof and a sagging front porch. I parked the car 50 feet away, by a tree stump. You couldn't see it from the main path, and from the looks of the place, nobody had stayed there for years. That was fine by me. I wanted peace and quiet. Inside, it was bare bones. Just a table, a chair, a small wood stove, and an old cot with a stained mattress. The windows were dirty and cracked. No electricity, just a few candle stubs in glass jars. I unpacked everything, checked the corners for spiders, and opened the windows to get the smell of mold out. It wasn't exactly cozy, but I didn't care. The first few days were uneventful. I read a lot. I made fires, cooked over them, wrote in my notebook, and walked in the woods. There was a small creek about a half-mile east where I got water. At night, I could hear owls whine through the branches, and sometimes something crunching through leaves. But that's normal. Animals move at night. I didn't let my imagination run. On the 6th day, I noticed something that I hadn't before. Near the back of the cabin, maybe 50 yards into the trees, I saw what looked like a pile of broken glass half buried in a patch of moss. It wasn't bottles or junk. It was like someone had taken a single pane and smashed it carefully, stacking the shards in a small mound. They were flat, square-cut, some of them sharp as knives. A few pieces still had smudges on them like fingerprints. I didn't touch it, just stared at it for a while. Then I walked back inside and told myself it had probably been left by someone who used the cabin before me. Maybe a window broke and they dumped the glass there. But it didn't look like trash. It looked arranged. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound outside felt louder. There was no lock on the door, just a metal hook latch that hung loose when the wind pushed against the frame. I started keeping my hatchet near the bed, just in case. On day 8, something changed. I'd gone for my usual walk that morning, checked on the creek, then circled back through a trail I hadn't taken before. About 100 yards from the cabin, I saw shoe prints in the mud. Not mine. Too large, too deep. They were recent, maybe a few hours old. They came from deeper in the forest and stopped about 10 feet from the cabin's back wall, then turned around and went back the way they came. That rattled me. Nobody was supposed to be out there. There were no other cabins within miles. I crouched down and stared at the prints for a long time. They weren't boot prints. They looked like work shoes, flat soles, no tread. I walked back to the cabin slowly. My hands were cold, but I was sweating under my jacket. I checked inside. Nothing missing, nothing moved. But from that moment on, I started watching the tree line more carefully. I stopped leaving the cabin after dark. On the 10th night, it rained. Hard. The kind of rain that shakes the roof and makes you feel like you're inside a drum. Couldn't sleep. The wind pushed water under the door and made the candle flames lean sideways. I sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the wall. 3 solid taps, slow and deliberate, right behind my bed. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. I waited. Nothing. I didn't move until morning. When I went outside, there were more footprints. Same type. They circled the cabin this time. In some spots, the grass was flattened like someone had been lying down, watching. And near the fire pit, I found something placed on the log I used for sitting. A shard of glass. It was long, maybe 8 inches, and one edge had been wrapped in dirty cloth like a handle. I didn't touch it. I went back inside, shut the door, and moved the cot against it. I didn't eat that day. I didn't write. I just sat by the stove, holding the hatchet in both hands. I thought about leaving, but my car was nearly out of gas, and the nearest town was hours away. I didn't have a gun, and there was no cell service. I was stuck unless I wanted to hike for miles with barely any supplies. I figured whoever was out there would move on if I made it clear I wasn't going to mess with them. But they didn't move on. That night, I heard scratching. Not animals, not wind. Scratching. Light, steady, like fingernails on wood. It started near the window, moved along the side of the cabin, and stopped near the door. I didn't open it. I didn't move. Then, after a long pause, came the breathing. I could hear it. Through the thin door. Shallow, steady breathing. Just on the other side. No footsteps. No voice. Just air moving in and out of someone's lungs. Then silence. The next morning, I found boot prints again. Deeper this time. Like he'd been standing there for hours. Watching. Waiting. And near the creek, I found another shard of glass. This one smaller but sharp. Stuck into the mud, pointing up like a warning. I didn't even go back to the cabin that time. I stood by the creek for a while, then walked into the woods in the opposite direction. I stayed out all day. I thought maybe if I stayed away long enough, they'd leave. But when I returned just before dark, the cabin door was open. The cot was flipped. My pack had been opened and dumped out. The candle jars were smashed, and one of the windows had been broken from the inside. There was mud on the floor, and on the table, another glass shard stood upright, stuck in the wood like a knife. I snapped. I threw everything into my bag. My clothes, my notebook, the food that wasn't spoiled. I didn't even care about leaving anything behind. I grabbed the hatchet and took off down the path toward my car. It was almost pitch black, but I didn't stop running. When I reached the car, the driver's side window was gone, shattered. The seat was covered in tiny bits of glass, and on the dash, Someone had carved a long line into the plastic. A single, deep scratch. I turned the key. The engine coughed. It started. I drove down that rutted path like I was being chased. Branches scraped the sides. I hit a stump hard enough to lift the back wheels. I didn't care. I just kept going. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop until I hit a gas station almost 2 hours later. I looked like hell. Mud on my face, blood on my palms from gripping the hatchet too tight. The clerk stared at me like I just crawled out of a hole. I paid for gas, got in the car, and didn't look back. I never went back to Idaho. I never told anyone the full story either. I sold the car a few months later. I moved south, closer to people, to noise, to light. Sometimes I still think about that cabin, about the man I never saw, just his tracks, his glass, his breathing. I don't know what he wanted, but I know what he was willing to do to get it. And every once in a while, when I'm driving late at night or walking home alone, I swear I hear it again. That slow, steady breathing just behind me. I don't turn around. Not anymore. I was 36 when I took a long break from everything. This was back in 2019. I just left my job in Liverpool, where I'd worked 12 years as a design technician in a warehouse. I wasn't laid off or anything. I just walked out. Too much pressure, too many years of pretending I cared. My girlfriend had moved out 6 months before, and when I realized I didn't really miss her, that was kind of the last piece falling into place. So, I sold a few things, cleared out my bank account, and booked time off without knowing if I'd even return. I didn't want a hotel or some crowded Airbnb. I needed to get away properly, out where I wouldn't hear traffic, see anyone I knew, or have to answer my phone every 2 minutes. I looked around online and found this listing on a niche holiday site, Stone Moor Retreat Cabin, located outside of a small village called Elksmere in Northumberland, a remote stone cabin, old but renovated, sitting on a patch of land near some low hills and trees, about 4 miles from the closest road and 7 miles from the nearest town. The pictures were minimal, just a small stone cabin with a pitched roof, a thin chimney, wooden shutters, and a narrow gravel path that disappeared into the woods. It was exactly what I wanted. I took the train up from Liverpool to Hexham and rented an old white Peugeot from a local hire place. The drive out was long. Elksmere itself was nothing more than a butcher, a pub, and a petrol station. The roads got narrower and worse the further I went. Eventually, I reached the little car park where the gravel track started. I parked, grabbed my rucksack and gear, and started walking the last 4 miles into the woods. The first thing I noticed on that walk was how quiet everything was. No wind, no birds, no rustling branches, just the crunch of gravel under my boots. The trees weren't thick, but they stood close enough together to cast long shadows across the trail. The deeper I went, the more the path became uneven and mossy. The whole place had that untouched feeling, like nobody had walked it in weeks. When I finally saw the top of the cabin roof between the trees, I stopped and just stared. It looked even older than in the pictures, like it had been sitting there for centuries. The stone was dark and moss-covered. The wood of the shutters and the front door looked swollen from years of rain. There was a narrow chimney on the back corner. A battered wooden chair sat outside under the small porch overhang, tilted sideways. I stepped inside. The air smelled like old firewood and damp stone. The interior was simple. One main room with a fireplace on the far side, a single bed against the right wall, a small table and chair, a countertop with an old kettle and a gas burner. There was a tiny bathroom, no bigger than a wardrobe, with a compost toilet and a pump sink. The tap water came from a nearby well. No electricity, no Wi-Fi. Perfect. I dropped my pack, opened the shutters to let in the dim light, and stood there for a few minutes listening to the stillness. No cars, no voices, no clocks ticking. Just silence. The first couple of days passed slowly. I spent my time walking the trail around the cabin, cooking simple food, reading from an old book I'd brought, and sleeping more than usual. I didn't see another person. I didn't even see a plane overhead. At night, it got cold fast. The wind would pick up a bit, and the only sound was the groan of the old wood as the cabin settled. It was the third night when something changed. I'd been lying on the bed, reading by lantern light, when I heard the crunch of gravel outside. Just a few footsteps, slow, uncertain. I froze. There hadn't been a single car or voice in days. Nobody was supposed to be out here. I told no one where I was going. There was no reason anyone would be walking around this far from the road at this time of night. I stayed still, listening. A few more steps, then nothing. I waited another 10 minutes, then got up and carefully walked to the door. I didn't open it. I just listened. No sound, no wind, no movement. After a while, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There weren't any footprints I could see, but the ground was mostly gravel and dry leaves. Not easy to leave a mark. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal and tried to forget about it. That day, I went further out along the trail, past a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There were some stones in a rough circle and what looked like the remains of an old bench, probably from when the place was built. As I was walking back, I noticed something strange along the tree line. Just a flicker. Figure, maybe. I stared, heart thudding. Nothing there. Just the trees. That night, just after I got into bed, I heard it again. Steps. Same slow crunching. This time, I moved quickly to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. There was a woman. She stood maybe 20 feet from the cabin, just beyond the edge of the trees. Thin, wearing a long coat, her hair dark and messy. I couldn't see her face well, but she was facing the cabin, facing me. She didn't move. I didn't breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, watching. A minute? 2? Then I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. I left the lantern on. I kept listening for sounds, but everything stayed silent. Too silent. The next morning, I didn't even bother with breakfast. I packed my bag and walked the 4 miles back to the car. But when I got there, the Peugeot was gone. I stood in the little gravel lot, confused and angry. I checked the ground, no broken glass, no sign of forced entry. It was just gone, like someone had towed it, but that made no sense. There was no tow company that would come out here. There was no reason anyone would even know I was here. I had no signal on my phone. I walked back to the cabin, legs shaking, mind racing. The sun was setting again. Back inside, I tried to calm down. I boiled some water and sat at the table, sipping tea with shaking hands. I didn't open the shutters that night. I locked the door. I sat in bed with the lantern on, staring at the door. Around midnight, I heard tapping on the back wall.
Top.
Pause. Tap, tap, like fingernails on the stone. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe through my nose. I just listened, every muscle in my body tight. After a few minutes, it stopped. But then, I heard the door handle move, just a little, like someone was testing it. I had a knife in my boot, just a short one I used for cooking. I pulled it out and stood near the wall, heart beating in my ears. No one came in. Eventually, I heard footsteps again, moving away into the trees. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I forced myself to go outside. The air was cold and sharp. I walked around the back of the cabin. There were faint scuff marks on the mossy ground. Someone had definitely been there. I walked further, into the woods, just a few yards beyond the edge of the clearing. I found something hanging from a branch. It was a piece of red ribbon tied to a bundle of sticks. The sticks were bent into a rough shape, almost like a human figure. A twig doll. Not fancy or artistic. Just a few snapped branches and string. I dropped it and walked back to the cabin fast. That was the day I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything again, filled my bottle from the well, and started walking the 7 miles toward town. I didn't care how far it was. I was getting out. I planned to call someone once I reached signal. Halfway down the trail, I saw her again. She was standing on the path ahead. Same long coat, same wild hair, face pale and narrow, eyes wide and staring. She didn't speak, didn't move. I cut into the trees to go around her. I walked wide and fast. When I looked back, she wasn't there anymore. It took me almost 4 hours to reach the main road. A farmer in a Land Rover picked me up. I told him I got lost hiking and my car was gone. He didn't ask many questions. He dropped me at the next town, where I called the hire company. They said the Peugeot had been returned earlier that day. I never gave the keys to anyone. I went straight to the train station and rode back to Liverpool that night. I never reported it. Never called the rental site or asked about the cabin. A few weeks later, I tried to find the listing again. It was gone. I tried looking up Elksmere on the map. There's no village by that name in Northumberland. I still don't know what really happened out there. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I never have. But I know there was a woman. I know she was real. And I know she didn't want me there. I still dream about the sound of her footsteps on gravel. Every time I hear tapping on a wall, I feel that same pressure in my chest. And I never, ever book cabins anymore. It was October of 2018 when I decided to get away for a while. I had just turned 36. I was tired. I needed space away from everything and everyone. My job back in Fresno had become a pressure cooker. I had broken up with someone I had been with for 4 years. And to top it off, my sleep had gone downhill. I was waking up 3 or 4 times a night, feeling wired for no reason. I told my boss I needed a few days off and packed up my truck. A guy I had once worked with mentioned a little cabin in Utah he had rented during a road trip. "Nothing around for miles," he said. And I remembered that line while planning this trip. I texted him and he sent me a pin. I booked it through a private listing. The guy who owned the place just gave me the directions and a code for the lockbox. It was in southern Utah, somewhere near Fish Lake National Forest, though not inside the park itself. The cabin sat a little higher up, off a winding dirt road that hadn't seen fresh grading in years. I got there just before dark on a Wednesday. The last 20 miles were all dust and rocks and bumping around in my seat. Not a single car in sight. I hadn't seen another person for at least an hour. The cabin looked decent from the outside. A small place, 1 level, maybe 20 feet wide, made of dark wood that had faded over time. No fancy porch, just a single step leading to the door. 1 window in the front. A rusted metal chimney stuck out from the roof. There were a few chopped logs stacked up by the side, and the dirt around the cabin was flat and hard, like it hadn't rained in weeks. I parked beside the cabin, unlocked the door, and went in. It smelled like pine and dust. The inside was even simpler than I expected. A single open room, wooden walls, a small cot with a mattress that felt like it belonged in a jail cell, a counter with a couple of cabinets, and an old wood-burning stove in the corner.
No bathroom.
Just an outhouse about 50 feet behind the cabin. There was no power, but the owner left a box of old candles and a big metal lantern that ran on white gas. I had my flashlight too, and enough batteries to last the week. I brought enough canned food and water to keep me fed and hydrated, and I had my .38 revolver just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I always brought it when I went out to these kinds of places. The first night was calm, cold but not unbearable. I lit a fire in the stove and slept in my jacket. I could hear the wind brushing through the trees outside. The sound was soft, distant. It was the kind of quiet you only get when you're really far from anything human. I slept surprisingly well that night. The second day, I just sat around reading, walked a bit along the dirt road. I didn't want to go too far in case I lost my bearings. There were no trail markers, no signs, just dirt, scattered trees, and huge rock formations in the distance. The kind of terrain that felt like it could swallow you if you didn't pay attention. I went to bed early that night. Then, on the third night, something felt off. It started with a sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just a shuffle. A single, short movement outside, near the back of the cabin. It was around midnight. I had just woken up needing to piss. I usually stepped outside to do that, since the outhouse was too far for the middle of the night. I sat up on the cot, grabbed my flashlight, and paused when I heard it. It sounded like someone had stepped on a branch. I froze, turned off the flashlight, sat still in the dark. My hand slowly found its way to the revolver. Nothing, just wind. I waited maybe 5 minutes. Then I got up, crept toward the back window, and peeked out through the crack in the curtain. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and faint moonlight on the dry ground. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked out behind the cabin to check. The dirt there was hard-packed, not the kind that takes prints easily. But about 10 feet from the back wall, I saw something odd, 2 scuff marks, side by side, pointing toward the trees. They didn't look like boot prints or anything that distinct, but it looked like something or someone had dragged their feet through there. Maybe a deer. Maybe I imagined it. But I started feeling watched after that. I spent that day sharpening sticks. I know how that sounds. Paranoid. But something deep in me had flipped. I hadn't seen another person in days, hadn't heard a single car or airplane. It was just me and whatever was out here. And I didn't know what that whatever was. That night, I locked the door and braced a chair against it. Sat on the cot with my revolver next to me. Didn't light a fire. I wanted to keep a low profile. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, slower, like someone was circling. The crunch of leaves. The lightest scraping sound, like a foot sliding over dirt. Then silence. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, a louder sound, like a hand dragging across the side of the cabin. Long and steady. I raised the revolver and kept the flashlight off. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I waited. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing else happened. The next morning, I checked again. On the left side of the cabin, there were streaks in the dirt. Long marks that looked like someone had moved slowly while crouched low. I couldn't see clear prints, but the path curved behind the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I told myself I'd leave, pack up and drive out. But when I started the truck that afternoon, the engine sputtered, then stalled. I tried again. Same thing. I opened the hood, checked the basics. Battery was fine. Fuel was fine. But it just wouldn't stay on. I'm not a mechanic, but I knew something wasn't right. Maybe air in the fuel line. Maybe worse. I was stuck, and I had 3 days left on my planned trip. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner of the cabin, back against the wall, flashlight and gun on my lap. It didn't take long before I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Closer. Then silence. Then the door rattled. Just once. Then a sound I can't forget. The sound of a voice trying to copy movement. Not speech. Just mimicry. Like someone trying to breathe like I did, walk like I did. It wasn't whispering. It was imitation. I didn't move. At some point, maybe around 4 a.m., I must have passed out. I woke up to light slipping through the cracks in the curtain. I went outside with my flashlight and found new tracks. Closer to the door this time. Whatever it was, it knew I was inside. I didn't eat that day. My hands were shaking too much. I stayed in the cabin with the gun on my lap, waiting. I checked the truck again, tried starting it, but no luck. That evening, just before sunset, I thought I saw something in the trees. Not a person, not clearly, but something tall, thin, pale. It didn't move like a person. Crouched, then stood still, then crouched again. I stared for a full minute, holding my breath. Then it vanished behind a tree. I didn't go out after that. The last night was the worst. Around 11 p.m., I heard scratching. Not at the door this time, but under the floor. The space beneath the cabin was low, just enough for crawl space. I had checked it earlier in the trip. Nothing down there but dirt and spiderwebs. But now I could hear movement beneath the floorboards. Then the back wall creaked. Then the window beside the cot, it wasn't broken, but I heard tapping. Slow and steady. I sat in the corner again, too scared to move. I kept the flashlight off, just held the gun tight in my hand. The tapping stopped. Then I heard breathing, not mine, came from just outside the window, and it stayed there for what felt like hours. Just soft, shallow breathing. Then it stopped. At sunrise, I packed everything. Didn't care what was broken. I tried the truck one last time, and somehow it started. I didn't question it. I didn't even wait for it to warm up. I just drove. Fast. Didn't stop until I hit the first gas station 2 hours away. I didn't tell anyone at the time. I didn't know what to say. I still don't know what I saw, but I do know what I felt. I've been in bad places before, but this was different. It wasn't just fear. It was something older. Something that watched me like it understood me. Something that stayed low, moved slow, and never made a sound it didn't want me to hear. Some people talk about skinwalkers out in those parts. They always sound like stories made up around campfires. I don't believe in fairy tales, but I believe in instincts. And everything in me, every part of me, knew I needed to get out of that place before it got closer. I never went back. I never will. And now, whenever I go somewhere remote, I always check the floorboards. Always carry extra fuel. And I never, ever stay in one place too long. Whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And I was lucky it let me leave.